Okay, Spatial Sharks back with the next video in Unit 5, Agriculture. And in this video, we're going to be focusing on mostly the United States and the big commercial type farming that's going on in this part of the world. And we'll also be talking about landscape patterns and the way that rural land is kind of marked off and set aside and divided up into property arrangements. So when you did the geo-inquiry, we talked about different land division systems in U.S. history. And, for the most part, Americans had been living in the East Coast, the Atlantic seaboard, in these nucleated kind of clusters, hamlets and villages. And you see these all throughout New England. Those of you that are Revolutionary War history buffs, you know that there would be a common area or a green in the middle of these tiny little villages. And, everybody would kind of farm the areas around that nucleated cluster of homes. As we move out into the Midwestern United States after the Revolutionary War, and we go over the Appalachians and out into what originally had been known as the Northwest Territory, ironically, we're talking Indiana, Michigan, Iowa, Wisconsin. The homes started getting dispersed, and your nearest neighbor might be 2-3 miles down the dusty road. Even still today, if you ever know anything about like small town Indiana basketball, you ever see the old classic movie Hoosiers, you get on a bus and you'd ride 3 hours to go play your closest rival in basketball, high school basketball. So that's what we mean by these kind of dispersed settlements. And of course, property ownership laws, the land division systems that you see are affected by inheritances. In some cultures, the oldest child gets everything. In other cultures, the land is divided up equally amongst all of the heirs. So that's going to, affect the land pattern. Does the land stay in its original state in terms of size and dimensions and boundaries, or does it continuously get cut up into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces? So that will be important to look at on the landscape as well. In the United States, as you know from the geo-inquiry, but as well, we talked about this when we watched the Food Machine, and we start talking about how the land looks, especially from a distantiated perspective when you fly over it, satellite imagery, aerial photography, those kinds of things. So historically in the United States, the English colonists preferred the meets and bounds system. And you can certainly see this within the United Kingdom as well. And these are the jigsaw puzzle type pieces that, the actual physical boundaries of the land become the property ownership boundaries. So creeks and little streams and hillsides and the crest of hills and the tree lines, all of these physical factors become part of the boundaries of individual farms. And you get this jigsaw puzzle type appearance where no two farms are the same size or the same shape. And that's the meets and bounds, and again, very English system on the Atlantic seaboard. When the Spanish came to America, they generally favored a gridded system, and everything was kind of surveyed out. If you were a patrol in the fifth grade, or in your fifth grade elementary school, you went to St. Augustine on a field trip. A lot of kids in Florida do that. You'll remember that St. Augustine is a perfectly gridded, landscape. All of the streets meet at right angles. All the property ownership is laid out in these squares. The French, because of their unique physical geography with the rivers, especially the Mississippi, and even if you go up into Quebec, you find the St. Lawrence River, this phenomenon of what we call long lots, where the property ownership went from the river back, and you get these really narrow strips of land so that the farmers would have a way to transport their produce to the market by floating it down the river. So the United States government, well, after independence, one of the first big things, and really one of the only things that the old Articles of Confederation government ever really accomplished, was to create a land division system where the Northwest Territories, like I said, the old Ohio's and Indiana's and Illinois and those areas were laid out in this rectangular survey. And this was what we sometimes call township and range, because if you look at the map map even still today. You go on Google Earth and kind of check this out. You'll zoom in on these counties, and there will be a town right in the middle of the county, and then there'll be all of these farms that kind of surround it. So it's township and then the range. And what happens is you would get these sections of land. And if you remember, a square mile is 640 acres. So you would have these sections of 160 acres, and those could then be subdivided even smaller. If you really want to check it out, you can go check out the Northwest Ordinance of 1785. That was the original land division system for the United States government, ironically penned by Thomas Jefferson. He wrote a few other things, if you remember. And so this land division system of the rectangular survey can be seen all over the Midwestern United States. Now, during the Civil War, Congress kind of doubled down on that idea and said, okay, everything west of the Mississippi, let's create another rectilinear kind of geometric kind of fantasy borderland, because everything out there was flat anyway on the plains. So you get the Homestead Act of 1862, and this is why everything west of the Mississippi tends to be big rectangles, not just the counties, but even the states. So when you fly over that rectangular space, we sometimes call those the flyover states, you're going to see that same pattern. Just a quick visual of what we mean by some of these. And again, this would be very English, the clustered. This would be very French, right? The long lots. This would be very Spanish with the grids. Rounded and walled, we don't really see those too much in the United States, but historically, walled villages were very common in the medieval times in Europe, and the rounded villages are very common both in Asia and in Africa. So we'll talk about two big kinds of farming that happen in the United States. One, dairy. Now, this is an interesting phenomenon because even though there's less dairy farms in the United States today, we're producing more milk than ever before. This is because of technology. This is the corporate control over the big dairies. Because they have less farms, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's less milk. In fact, the cows are much more efficient today. The milking systems are mechanized. It's a huge business in the United States, dairy products, and not just milk, but also cheese or yogurt and butters and creams. And this is very Von Thunian because if you think about it, in the original days, milk had to be delivered fresh. Today, it's all part of a cool chain. It's all refrigerated from one end to the other. And this is why we did the little homework activity where I asked you to find out where your milk was from. And when you put in that dairy code, you can find out the geographical patterns of how we distribute dairy products across the United States. Most countries that are wealthy will drink cow milk, of course. If you go to poorer countries, you'll find that they drink the milk of other kinds of beasts of burden. You could drink yak milk, water buffalo milk. Obviously, goat milk is very popular, and certainly with cheeses as well. If you go to Europe, you'll find that a lot of cheeses, they're not just cow cheese, made out of sheep's milk and made out of goat milk. And some of those cheeses are the big, expensive, stinky cheeses that you find in some of the European countries. And a lot of Americans will pay a lot of money for those imported cheeses. In the United States, of course, one state really dominates it when you think about cheese, and that's the fans that wear cheese on their heads to the Packers games in Green Bay. But dairying is a big deal. And as I said, less dairy farms, but more mechanization, more technology. This is a typical milking parlor in the modern day. And notice you don't really see a whole lot of humans here. There's nobody who's sitting on a wooden stool milking the cow by hand into a metal pail. This is very typical of the modern dairy in the United States. And like I said, fewer dairy farms, but more milk production than ever before. So when you think about milk production, just a quick chart showing you, Europeans actually even more milk production than the United States. One difference, of course, is in Europe, your milk is not always as cold and refrigerated as we like to have it with our Oreos over here in the United States. South Asia, remember, India has a lot of cows. Remember that the Hindus won't eat the beef, but they will drink the milk. So because all those cows are there, there is a lot of milk production. And then this just kind of shows you the same thing from the chart to the graph to the map. And so it's very important that you can see these patterns not only in the quantitative form, but when you put it on the map here, those quantities become very visual for you to be able to see the patterns and be able to explain those. So truck farming, this is something that we see right here in our little part of South Florida. The word truck was originally a verb, and it meant that you carried vegetables to the market. And if you remember, the entire Vontunian pattern is set up for all the farmers to take their produce to the central market. So when you truck something, you are carrying it off to the marketplace. In Von Thunen's perfect world, this would be a farmer with a wooden cart pulled by two oxen, no roads, flat surface. Remember all of the isotropic assumptions that are very important when we talk about Von Thunen. So that's where this word comes from. So today, of course, a truck is something that carries a heavy load. And all up and down 441 here in Palm Beach County, you can see these big trucks carrying fruits and vegetables from all these farms that are generally west of Lyons. That's the agricultural preserve of Palm Beach County. And those trucks are carrying those fruits and vegetables all the way up the I-95 corridor from one end of our country to the other, all over the southeastern United States. Other areas of our country that are big for fruits and vegetables, remember the Central Valley of California, to some degree in the Mississippi Valley, upstate New York, Pennsylvania, in those areas of rural Pennsylvania. So, but really California, Florida are the two biggest concentrations of fruit and vegetable farming. A lot of this is migrant labor. It's not local labor. These migrant workers will be bussed from one end of the country to the other. In California, one big difference, of course, is that they got to use irrigation, as we saw in the food machine video, because it's the one thing that nature didn't provide for the farmers of California. Everything else that they need is pretty much there, but they don't have the water. So they got to, pump it in. They got to irrigate. In the United States, this access to fresh fruits and vegetables is becoming a big social issue because there are many parts of the country where fresh fruits and vegetables are not available. And so geographers have called these areas food deserts. And last year, this was one of the big essay questions. And the first part of it asked, what information, what geospatial data would a geographer need in order to map a food desert? And you think about that, it's the where and the why there. And, to know where the food desert is, you kind of have to know where the people are, and you kind of have to know where the grocery stores are. And, if you plot where the grocery stores are and where the people are, and you find out that the people are not where the stores are, or vice versa, the stores are not where the people are, guess what? You've got a food desert. So, what are some of the health issues? If you don't have access to healthy food, this is where we get problems with diabetes, obesity, because very often these people resort to a diet that's high in foods that are processed, a lot of salt, a lot of fat, a lot of sugar, a lot of fast food, because it's cheap and affordable. And, we can, again, map out where these food deserts are. Many cities, we saw this, like, for example, in Detroit, Chicago, where you have these community-supported agricultural programs where residents will band together and create little vegetable gardens and maybe sell a little bit of it at farmers markets, but a lot of it is to become healthier eaters themselves. So a lot of this is due to transportation. And really, you're going to look at several patterns here. The Deep South, Appalachia, from Kentucky up into West Virginia. A lot of the big urban areas will have no access to the supermarkets. And then, of course, these two areas here I'm going to focus on because I'm going to show you a map here in just a second. And these are maps that we did all the way back in Unit 1 when we talked about ethnic breakdowns in the United States. And I want to point out something to you. Memorize this kind of map here of the food desert phenomenon. And most of these are not urban food deserts. These are rural food deserts. The question on the exam last year was only about urban, and I'll show you that in just a second as well. But when you look at this, look at your percentage of African American, and then kind of toggle back and forth, and just kind of look at this kind of overlapping pattern that these food deserts are also areas of poverty. And poverty is in the Deep South. A lot of it is entrenched in the black communities of small towns. It's not just poor black people, though. It is also poor white people who don't have access to some of these grocery stores. So, a lot of times we want to make it all about race, and a lot of times it's also about place. And certainly you can see some of the urban places. Here's Detroit, here's Chicago. So that's, a phenomenon that we can see. But then also I want you to go back and look here at the Four Corners area and out here in the Dakotas. And then we're going to go on this one and then look at these Native American, a lot of these are reservations. And again, the grocery stores just don't operate in these areas. Mostly it's a profit issue where, the residents are very low income and the stores won't be profitable, and therefore they tend to avoid these kinds of areas. So when you look at no car, no supermarket within a mile, you're going to find that people don't have access to fresh whole food. And then, of course, we could, kind of change scale, zoom in, and make this an urban issue. And again, notice the kind of patterns that you see here in terms of the farthest distance from the grocery stores tend to be the areas that are racially concentrated. So, income is an issue. Historical patterns of land division are apparent. We're going to talk about redlining when we get into the urban unit, which is Unit 6. But again, look at these patterns and look at the correlation between where these food deserts are, who tends to live in these neighborhoods. And you can really then start to extrapolate this out and say, well, is this part of the achievement gap in terms of, school achievement and testing scores and things like that? Because again, big indicator of testing, scoring in the United States is family income. It's nice to be at Spanish River where you guys are hardworking, you care about your grades, your parents care about your grades, and of course, we push you to be your best. It would be different if, you didn't get a good breakfast and you didn't know where your next meal was coming from and you didn't have access to all the fresh, healthy food that you guys enjoy. So that's basically where we'll stop on this particular unit. We wanted to talk a little bit about farming in the United States.